And we're going. Good evening, everyone. This is the first in my series of just unscripted videos that I'm doing to get into the swing of putting stuff out there once again. And today I wanted to talk about something that I find interesting, and maybe you'll find interesting too. A remembrance agent. Now, what is a remembrance agent? Well, as you may have guessed from the title, which I will freely admit is a little over-exaggerated, a remembrance agent is akin to a digital assistant, but it has some key differences. Now, think about something like Siri. How does Siri work? Well, you have to start out with a question, a query, is what they're formally called. So I'm going to move the microphone. You start with a query. You start with a question for Siri, a command, a prompt, whatever. Then it goes into the magical box, and then Siri gives you something useful. Now, the problem with this is, if you want to use Siri for something, you have to know what you want to do. You have to know what if you're asking for like a note or a reminder, you have to know what you're looking for. And this is a generalizable problem to all things in computers. How many times have you not been able to find a file on your computer? It's there. It's on the computer, after all. You saved it to disk, you didn't delete it. But you can't remember where it is. You can't find it, and the computer isn't really helping you. The remembrance agent is a solution to that problem. And it has an interesting history. And it's an interesting concept. I'm having trouble determining which way I want to go with it first. Well, in computer science, an agent is basically anything that can make decisions. That's a very rough definition. It's not rigorous at all. Basically, it's anything that can make decisions and interact with its environment. Something like Siri would be an agent where it takes input from the user and then does something. What the remembrance agent does is it works on its own. It's an autonomous agent. It works on its own constantly and then feeds things to the user. A remembrance agent is a lot more like a clock that's always running than a digital assistant you call on for help. But why? What's its purpose? The remembrance agent is essentially an augmented memory. That's its purpose. That's its ambition. It serves as an augmented associative memory. Sort of like how you'll think like, okay, I have an appointment at 3 o'clock. Where is that appointment? What's the appointment for? Who can I expect to see there? Just like how your memories are a tree of links between other points of information, what the remembrance agent tries to do is it tries to act as that on its own for you and help you out by increasing associative recall artificially. Now, I know what you're wondering. Gee, James, how do you do that? Well, it's kind of simple. The remembrance agent program essentially consists of two parts. There's the reader. I'm going to call it the reader anyways. It's convenient for me. And then there's the scanner. Okay, reader, scanner. Now, what's the reader doing? Well, the basic concept of the remembrance agent is whatever you're doing on your computer. Maybe you're reading through web pages, maybe you're reading through emails, maybe you're typing up something or programming something on your own. The reader sees it. The reader looks at what you're doing. Looks at what you're doing. And then what it does is it compares what you're doing to a database. Basically, it'll take the last, like one example given was like it would take the last 500 words around your cursor on the screen and the last 500 words before that, and it would look through a database to try and find things that are associated with that, things that are relevant to what you're reading or writing or doing. What's that database consist of? Your files. Basically, your files are going to be put into a sort of like vector database so the reader can always be comparing what you're looking at to things you have in your file storage. That can be notes you've taken, that can be emails that you've written or received, it can be programs, it could be anything. Theoretically anything. There's practical limits, but you get the picture. And it just like reads through that database and compares it to what you're looking at constantly. And when it finds files that match very well to what you're doing, typically through like word frequency matching, it displays relevant files. Basically, the reader looks at what you're doing, just looks at like the last couple hundred words of what you're reading or writing or whatever, compares it via word frequency or some other matching algorithm to your files, specifically a vector database that allows you to search through it very quickly. And it compares it to your files and finds ones that match very well, that theoretically are very relevant to what you're doing. And then finally displays those relevant files on your desktop so that you can, if you want, you just like with a click, with a shortcut, you can open the relevant files up and take a look at it, and you'll be remembered as something associatively. Like, for example, if like you see something where it's like, oh, it's like coupons for dance, you might be able to get something recommended to you, like, oh, there's a dance event coming up. Maybe this would be a good opportunity for me to learn. That's one example. Maybe you're like looking through, like you're trying to type up schedule, you're trying to plan something with somebody, trying to plan an appointment. This could bring up calendar files that could tell you which times are available, which ones aren't. Things like that. Maybe you type someone's name and like it brings up relevant research papers that they wrote or like emails that they sent you. That sort of thing. So yeah, it does all sorts of things where it like basically creates associative links between what you're working on right now and files in your computer. Essentially, it helps you like form links between what you're doing right now and memories that you might have forgotten to access. Where does this database come from, though? Well, essentially what the scanner does is, like an example that they made of the Remembrance agent is like, once a day, it scans through all the files that you find could be relevant, research papers, notes, that sort of thing, and turns it into that vector database so that the reader can scan it throughout the day. And basically, that's more or less how the Remembrance agent works. It just constantly views what you're doing, compares it with stuff you've done in your past, essentially memories, and connects what you're doing now to things that you have available that you might find useful or relevant, things you may have forgotten about. Now, if you're anything like me, you're probably thinking, well, gee, that sounds pretty cool. Golly gee whiz. That's some future stuff. And you're probably wondering, why didn't that catch on? Well, this is where the trail gets a little bit fuzzy. And I have a few theories I'd like to share about why things like this didn't catch on, and why I don't think they're going to catch on in the future. Which is unfortunate, because it is a cool concept. If I had my normal-sized eraser, I'd be done by now. Alas. Boop, 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 boop. That looks pretty good. I don't think I'm doing half bad for something unscripted, so that's nice. Okay, so reasons for failure. First one, the year 1996. In 1996, the Remembrance agent was first proposed by, well, it was first posed, at least in part, by a man named Thad Starner, I don't quite remember his name, who was at the MIT Media Lab in the 90s, and he, with many other people, worked extensively with wearable computers and such. I would like to talk about wearable computers and work on some of my own, but that's a story for another day. But the Remembrance agent was first proposed in 1996. A wearable computer description came out in 1997. And then nothing happened for 20 years. Over 20 years. The most recent reference I really have for a Remembrance agent is 2020. Why? Well, for one thing, the GUI wasn't like super massively popular. Like, it was somewhat popular with Windows 3, but it only became massively popular and we got into computer in every home territory after 95, 96. This is all pre-dot-com bubble. So what I think happened is, with the massive surge of new users into the computer market, there's just a lot of stuff going on. Just like lots of products are being introduced. Again, like the dot-com bubble is like a few years away, but it is going to happen. And certain concepts like the Remembrance agent, which might have had a little bit more cachet, a little bit more interest otherwise, kind of got lost in the shuffle. I think that's one reason why it may have failed. Just, it came out at an inopportune time where lots of things were happening, and it just kind of got lost. But there's other reasons too. Some people have programmed Remembrance agents, but the only Remembrance agents I was able to find were made for Emacs. What's Emacs? Well, it's a sort of like text editor, program writer sort of thing. It has lots of functions. You can do lots of things with it. Like, people would sign up for like news groups and have their emails and BBS things to Emacs, and a lot of those things don't mean anything to anybody watching this. But Emacs, in many ways, is kind of the direct opposite of where the general computer-using populace went. Computers over time have gotten substantially easier and more user-friendly, and Emacs decidedly isn't. It's built by programmers for programmers, and there's nothing wrong with that. But as long as things like Remembrance agents or other programs are limited to Emacs, they're not getting larger market penetration. People aren't like seeing it and clamoring, oh, we want this, and people aren't expanding it into more and more different areas. If people implemented not Remembrance agents other places, would they have become more popular? Would they have like become a facet of computing technology? I don't know. Maybe if someone made a Remembrance agent extension for Thunderbird or Outlook or something, maybe things would have been different. But I can't, that's just speculation. All of this is speculation, but this especially. Another reason I have my doubts as to whether or not the Remembrance agent would have ever really gotten off the ground is just sort of like academia, if that makes sense. Again, the Remembrance agent was first generated at MIT's Media Lab. It came about in very speculative conditions and very academic conditions. People that were very much concerned with philosophy and the future of computing. And I feel like a lot of the times what happens with academic approaches to computer science and academic philosophy of computer science is concepts are generated which are interesting but become unpractical for a variety of reasons, or just aren't advertised as well as they should be to people who can use them. Things can be esoteric. And I feel like that's another reason why the Remembrance Agent failed to get off the ground. So that's 3 reasons why I think it failed initially. A lot of stuff going on, could have gotten lost in the shuffle, limited market penetration, and the fact that it was just like a component of academia and a relatively small, kind of obscure part of academia, at least for most of computer science. MIT and the stuff they do isn't obscure, but it's not always, again, like most practical, most applied, especially things like the Media Lab. So, and I think that's another part where it failed. Just like, wasn't super applied, wasn't super outlined, wasn't super publicized in a way that the computer science community would find it helpful. A fourth reason is debatably it doesn't work. This is a point of contention for lots of people. Some people say it works phenomenally. Some people say it works okay. Some people say it just does not work at all, just does not create relevant links between what you're looking at and other like files in your computer, other memories, essentially. And I'm not really going to count that because that could be fixed. That could be solved. Algorithms for natural language processing are getting better all the time. We are finding all sorts of new ways to determine relevance between things using computers. I feel like that's a problem that would be eventually surmountable. Now, it would be some years since 96. I wasn't alive in 96. It would take some time before digital assistants really became anything even resembling the norm. And that's possibly another limitation on why the Remembrance Agent didn't take off, but it would take years before things like Alexa or Siri or Google Home, all the little corporate spies, made their ways into our homes. So, and they've been around for a while, so why can't the Remembrance Agent make a comeback? Well, this one deals more with like the business side of things, and if I had to guess, there is one major reason why I don't think Remembrance Agents are going to come back. The cloud. Basically, everything in computers is moving to a cloud-based model, and we can talk about the ethics of that and the financial implications. Oof, my feet are asleep. But it just creates practical problems for a Remembrance Agent. The average person now logs into Outlook, logs into Facebook, logs into Twitter, logs into their podcasts and everything else, stores their documents even online. And there's a problem with that. The Remembrance Agent, if you don't remember, is very much, very, very much reliant on accessing your files as they are, as they exist on your computer, where it can get to them. If your documents are all saved in the cloud, which is increasingly what we're moving towards, the Remembrance Agent is going to have a harder time getting to them. Now, sometimes you'll have copies on your hard drive. Your Remembrance Agent will be able to access that. But other things, things like emails or calendars are often entirely cloud stored now, like things like Outlook, Exchange, iCalendar, whatever. Doesn't matter. The Remembrance Agent ain't going to be able to get to it. Things that you may want to access, like Facebook, Twitter, Google, whatever, are going to have complicated, somewhat complicated APIs that will often have rate restrictions that make using a Remembrance Agent to access them possibly forbidding, possibly challenging for a developer. And just generally, the transition to the internet is going to just make using a remembrance agent harder because it has less access to things. You're going to have to find ways to constantly be interfacing your computer with all these different services simultaneously and streaming them down into a single output of lines on a screen conveying relevant articles. And I think that's just a massive ask. I think that's a massive ask for developers to make something like that, especially when the general public doesn't really realize it can happen and maybe wouldn't find it that useful even if they did. So I just don't think the Remembrance agent is ever going to be massively wide-scale useful, just due to like the practical reasons of it's going to be extremely difficult for it to be able to do what people are going to want it to do. They may not even want it to do what they want it to do. There's going to be lots of privacy concerns because you're constantly just going up and down pinging online constantly. And again, for what benefit? For what reward? Generally, people are very happy with their digital assistants. People are fine with like setting timers on Siri or Alexa or the Google Home. They're fine with working with those. A remembrance agent would be different, and I just don't think that many people would see the utility. The debatable utility. So yeah, it's a shame. But these things happen. The industry of computing, like all other industries, is littered with the graves of ideas that were cool but didn't pan out. And I think it's interesting sometimes to look at ones that weren't super popular, weren't super interesting. Well, were interesting but weren't super popular, kind of like failed or just never got the traction, and just seeing what could they do? How might we be different if we had them? I think it's interesting. I like doing it. Well, this more or less concludes my first unscripted video on just a random thing I found interesting to try and get over my publishing anxiety. And while I repeated myself a fair bit, I don't think I did too bad, especially since it's about midnight right now as I'm recording this. So I'm very tired. I'm going to go to bed, but I think I did okay. One last thing, there is a brief video clip which I'm going to post up in the corner, one of these, I don't know which corner it is, but it's actually a YouTube clip of an interview that Thad Starner had with Alan Alda, presumably in the early 2000s, about wearable computers and the Remembrance agent. He even uses a wearable computing variant of the Remembrance agent while he's being interviewed by Alan Alda, and even has like a little like twiddler corded keyboard for controlling it and taking notes. And I just think that's cool. And I just think it's a cool interview. But yeah, that's it. That's the end of the video. Get out of here. Get out of here, you clowns. See ya.